Okay, good evening, everyone. Joining us live on Radio Sofia, and a very good afternoon to Professor Lawrence Hamilton, joining us live from the United Kingdom. In the past, on Radio Sofia, we've had discussions on sociology, theology, history, and of course, economics. For a change, today's discussion is around an individual whose name was coined by none other than Nobel laureate Rabindranath Tagore, and which meant immortal. And how prophetic it is that the individual's contributions in the field of economics indeed remain. I'm talking about Professor Amartya Sen and India's first Nobel laureate in the field of economics. And to talk about Professor Sen's contribution in the field of welfare economics and elucidate the abstract ideas in Professor Sen's ex-student and current Department of Politics and International Studies, Professor Lawrence Hamilton. Apart from his research interests involving various topics in political theory, South African political economy, and history of political and economic thought, he has researched extensively on the ethics and economics of the works of Professor Amartya Sen. He has recently authored a book on how to read Amartya Sen, and throughout the talk, he will be speaking on those themes and much more. We're indeed privileged to have you with us, Professor Hamilton, and we look forward to an engaging discussion ahead. So, as Professor Hamilton has suggested, that he'll kind of speak for around 15 to 20 minutes about the book and about the works of Professor Amartya Sen, followed by which we'll have the question and answer rounds with Professor Hamilton. Professor Hamilton, all to you now.
Many thanks, and good afternoon or good evening for you. Thank you so much for the invitation, Himadri and Kranti. It's a pleasure to be here. As you said, I'm just going to introduce the book. This is, as I think you probably know, this is the book in a second incarnation. The first edition was published by Polity in Cambridge, and I was asked to write the book. And the idea behind their series is to take really important social, economic, and political thinkers and make them accessible to a broader undergraduate and graduate audience. I was then approached, thanks to the work of Jean Drèze, I'm sure you'll know him, all of you, who I've in fact never met, but he very kindly read the manuscript of this book and really liked it. And so he got Penguin involved for an Indian edition. And this is the Indian edition called How to Read Amartya Sen. It's much more accessibly priced, and it comes with a new prologue by me and a foreword by Jean Drèze. And in the prologue, I link some of Amartya Sen's ideas to some of the difficulties we're facing under COVID, amongst other things. So I suppose the best way to introduce it is to kind of answer a set of questions. The one might be, why did I go about writing this book, and what did I hope to achieve through it? The first very important thing to say is that, of course, as I'm sure none of you doubt, the Amartya Sen's ideas are extremely important in their own sake. And they also cover a great deal of fields and subfields in economics, sociology, health, policy, politics, philosophy, you name it. There's very few people alive or who have ever lived, frankly, who have written so broadly and with such impact on so many factors. The other important thing about this volume is that it brings this kind of attempt to bring together a whole series of ideas into a coherent whole, and give it access to an audience in the global South. So I would very like, it pleases me a great deal that this book is accessibly priced for the Indian market. And I would hope that that would spread beyond India to much of the global South. Because in very many ways, although Amartya Sen has spent most of his academic life in the global North, in the United States and the UK, he is very much, as Jean-Dres puts it well in the foreword, he is the argumentative Indian par excellence. So many of his ideas come out of the Indian context, come out of many of the social, political, economic challenges that the Indian continent, the country of India faces. And so it's very pleasing that I can offer, especially some quite complex and in many cases very philosophically demanding ideas in more lucid language for a more global context. So that's the main impulse, and that's why I feel so obliged, and I'm so thankful to people like Jean-Dres and all of the crowd in Penguin, India, who have helped to bring this edition about. The other thing is to ask, I suppose, is what do I think is novel, or what did I want to bring to the fore in this book? And the first thing to say is that, given that I'm a political theorist mainly, there is an emphasis, if you want, or some might say an overemphasis, but there is a greater emphasis than might otherwise be the case if it was written by an economist, on a lot of components of Sen's work that impact directly and indirectly on the political sphere. So the book is broken down into 5 main substantive chapters: choice, capability, freedom, justice, and democracy. So you can see straight away, with the exception, I suppose, of choice and capability, that freedom, justice, and democracy are they're central ideas for Amartya Sen, but they're also central ideas in much of what we take to be, what people take around the world to be the central concerns of politics and political theory. The other thing to say is that, of course, it's no coincidence that, it's no coincidence that choice comes first in the book. And that's because in his early work, soon after his PhD that was more development focused, he focuses a great deal on a series of critiques of the main underpinnings for welfare economics, as received at the time in the 60s and 70s, and frankly, which is still more or less the case today. That is utilitarianism and utility. And his focus on capability, his focus on various criticisms of much of the perceived ways of thinking about the central core problems in welfare economics, based upon a series of assumptions that are a legacy of the significance of utilitarianism. In particular, the way we think about choice, the way we think about utility, and the way we think we can or cannot involve evaluations, interpersonal evaluations in these. Can you all hear me still okay? Yeah.
Yes, Professor. Perfect. Please go ahead.
So, so the book starts, well, actually, to be honest, the book, what I haven't done, and people may find this a little bit strange, just to say that gender and development as separate topics do not appear as separate chapters. And many who know the works of Amartya Sen well will find that unusual. Just to say that one of the reasons for that is because I bring in his gender critiques mostly throughout the various other topics I cover. And what I do in the introduction is that in the main introduction to the book, I introduce many of his ideas through the lens of development and development economics, because much of his ideas are not just set up as critiques of utilitarianism, and what follows for it in mainstream welfare economics, but they're also set up as a critique against many of the assumptions and arguments that are put forward in development economics and development studies from the 60s onwards. So development is most clearly there, it's just in the main introduction. And so I then move on to choice, and I then move on to what many have taken to be Amartya Sen's most important contribution, and that is what has become known as the capability approach. He calls it his concern for capabilities. And the reason that he makes that distinction is because the capability approach has grown, as it were, quite a lot, or way beyond Amartya Sen's ideas himself, or themselves. He's collaborated with so many people around the world at the United Nations, other academics like Martha Nussbaum, and many, many more beyond. And so the idea of capabilities has grown way beyond Amartya Sen's concern for capabilities. But in this book, I maintain a focus on Sen's account of capabilities, and I indicate to the reader where they can get a broader account of how the capabilities approach has developed more generally. And it's important to say that of course this capabilities approach comes out of this critique of welfare economics and utilitarianism, and it comes out of his concern with how better to think about development, how better to enable people who are in conditions of dire poverty and extreme inequality to escape those conditions. And one of the ways in which it's a bit of a clunky word, as he himself has accepted this idea of capability. And I just want to say something very quickly about that. Capability as a term is more than simply the capacity to do something. It's more than, as well, the ability to do something. It's more like what in English we would call potential or power, okay? So its meaning has to do with what is necessary, both subjectively and objectively, for individuals and groups to enact the agency or freedom, or you might say power, that Sen is concerned to enable in individuals. So in the third chapter, where I talk about freedom, I argue that in fact Sen has an account of what he himself calls freedom as effective power. So I'm not going to go into the details now, but there's a large literature on freedom, where freedom is understood as negative or positive or Republican in the main. And in fact, you could argue that Sen posits a fourth account of freedom, which is not the first, freedom from interference alone, that's the negative account, or the positive account being autonomous, which links up to a long and large literature that we won't go into now. And then the Republican account, which is, again, links up to a very large literature and is about enabling citizen control over representatives. As Sen argues so well against people, scholars such as Pettit and others, this idea of having control, direct control over policy or representatives, misdiagnoses much of what politics and policy formation is about. Really what he's concerned with is how do we generate the outcomes in economics and politics that provide us with greater levels of equality, that help us get those parts of our communities and nations and in the world out of dire poverty, and in particular, how we avoid the tendency to not just be parochial about this, but to be imperial about this, if you want. To think that theory can solve these questions at the level of theory. He's very forceful about the argument that he wants to keep the capability approach underspecified, right? So what the capability approach is about those functionings and capabilities that we need to enact our agency, but things like, for example, sufficient water, sufficient nutrition, the shirt we may need to wear to be seen as acceptable in our society, whatever that society deems acceptable, etc. All of these things, while they may be objective at a certain level of abstraction, they they're also deeply contextual. So they're also deeply determined by specific contexts. And so he doesn't want his capabilities approach to dictate from a theoretical perspective what people's functionings and capabilities are. What he would like is to provide a different conceptual language for understanding what is necessary for us to be powerful enough in our everyday interactions and in our social and economic and political interactions, such that we enable the potentiality that he sees as central to human beings. So that's the argument essentially of chapter 3, which is an argument that says that what we have here is an account of freedom as effective power. And then chapter 4 and 5 are mostly focused on work that I suppose he's been thinking about more than some of the more technical and difficult economic and philosophical work of 30, 40 years ago, although that's carried on. But he's shifted somewhat in the last 20 years to focus much more on politics and on questions of justice and democracy. And I mean, I won't go into all the detail of these arguments, but just to say that his famous big, at least large contribution is the idea of justice, and that's discussed a great deal in that 4th chapter on justice. And also I propose a slight critique of his account of justice. And then very importantly, both for India and for the globe and for places like South Africa, he provides a very subtle account of democracy that I also take issue with. So very quickly, he suggests that, very neatly as well, which is very helpful, he suggests that there are four main ways of thinking about democracy. A minimum or elitist account, a liberal or realist account, and then a deliberative account. So he thinks that he then argues that his account is somewhat different to the deliberative account, but it's very linked to it. And I suggest in the book that it's more or less the same as the deliberative account. And what he wants to suggest is that democracy is not just about elections. Democracy is also about creating a culture of deliberation and dissent for public reasoning to obtain. In other words, for people to be not just involved every 4 or 5 or 6 years in the choice of their representatives and and debates around policy, but all be involved in a much more active way and a much more deliberative way in between those election times as well. I'm a little skeptical of this argument because it doesn't have that much teeth as regards how you would empower people in between those elections. And it also lacks a bit of realism as regards how central representation is at least in representative democracies as we know them. And so it assumes away the significance of representation by focusing so much on the direct deliberation of individuals. And most importantly, I think the main takeaway or the main contribution I want to make that I make in this book in terms of a very slight critique of Amartya Sen's ideas is the idea that even though he has this enabling account of capabilities and he has this power-based account of freedom, when he gets down to brackets of him discussing justice and democracy, funnily enough, he leaves out a discussion of power. He leaves out very centrally out of those very important political, theoretical, and basic political discussions, what sort of institutional arrangements give rise to what kinds of power relations, and thus give rise to what kinds of preferences and needs that would determine our capabilities and functionings. So what I would say that we would need to add to much of Amartya Sen's incredible contribution to so many areas in economics, politics, sociology, philosophy, and so on, is an account of those power relations in various parts of the world, and an account of how we would ensure against the domination of certain individuals over others, and the domination of certain groups over others. And we would thereby get to a position in which we could enable the capability of individuals and groups in a way that his capability approach is really after, and in a way that wouldn't have to resort to the kind of identity politics that he is so concerned with, especially when he is reading the political world, as it were, through the lens of the conditions, concerns, preferences, etc. in India itself. I hope you enjoy it and I hope you buy it.
Yeah. Thank you, Professor Hamilton, for the wonderful introduction of the book. Let me start by asking you, I mean, you talked about the 5 key themes that kind of go, I mean, very consistently in your book around choice, capability, freedom, justice, and democracy. While Professor Sen's contributions could not have been better summarized than these 5 themes, how do you manage to kind of avoid the circularity of definitions involved in these concepts? Say, when you're talking about capability, you invariably talk about freedom. And while talking about freedom, you tend to talk about capability and choice. So, I mean, when I kind of studied Professor Sen for the first time, this circularity of definitions tended to confuse me a lot. How do you manage to address that?
So that's a really good question, actually. The main way in which I addressed it was that I only came to those 5 ways of thinking about the works as a whole right at the end of the process. I mean, I'd known his capabilities, work, and his capabilities in prep choice work and other areas that I hadn't spent much time on as a graduate student. And what I managed to see was that if I broke it down in this way, what I could do was to show a kind of historical development, right? So not only does this map, it doesn't map it perfectly at all, but it maps it in a certain sort of way, how so much in the 60s and 70s there's a focus on choice, then the famous equality of what essay brings out the capabilities approach. The freedom is a bit of a tricky one because he's concerned with a lot of freedom debates in the early 70s, and then he comes back to it when he's talking about development in the 80s. And justice and democracy are easier because they're later. So although it isn't an intellectual historical account, right, it is a basic introduction. So it's not a full intellectual historical account. It does trace in a very basic way a kind of historical development. And what I do is that to avoid that circularity, I mean, the first thing to say, I suppose, is that it's very difficult to avoid that circularity because, of course, these things are all tied up with one another. And completely understandably so, right? They're the ideas of one individual who is dealing with the development of his own ideas over time and incorporating the ideas of others. So by starting with choice and by starting with utilitarianism effectively, what I do is I start with the things that Sen is most concerned to critique early on. Okay, so I show how his dissatisfaction with the received opinion in welfare economics is based around a set of concerns. I link that to his early work on famines as well. And then I show that the capabilities approach is his response to that. Okay? It's a response both to it's a response, I suppose, to, in a way, it's a response to many things, but I suppose the most crucial thing it's a response to is how could we provide a different conceptual arrangement to enable an economic analysis that is true to what is going on in any context, and that also allows us to get involved in the kinds of things that utilitarianism and welfare economics were so concerned about, and that is intersubjective evaluation. So the thing that they were horrified about was the idea that a policy analyst could say one person's preference for X can be, in some sense, evaluated or compared to another person's evaluation or preference for X. And what he does is he fills his capabilities approach with a great deal more ethics, frankly, which allows him to get involved in this evaluative ethical process. And he shows through his work on Adam Smith and Aristotle and others that, of course, if you think more amply about economic problems, this is a very usual thing to be involved in, this evaluative process. It's only this arcane world of utilitarianism and welfare economics that became so dominant at the end of the 19th century and carried on, and still carries on to a certain extent, excuse me. Oh. Sorry. I hope that's not COVID. I think it's more to do with the fact that it's just been raining here and there's a great deal of pollen about. So in a way, what I try and do, and maybe that's why I have this developmental approach, is to show that, to take the last three concepts, right? And justice and democracy are drawing from, but they're not equivalent to, his accounts of capability and his critiques around choice. And if you read the idea of justice carefully, you'll see that he himself continuously goes back to two main themes. The one is social choice, and the other is capabilities. He's returning when he talks about justice and the components of justice all the time. When he at the end of many of his chapters, when he's giving his final words on various subparts of his discussion of justice, he is often making reference to his earlier social choice critiques and his accounts of freedom and his most definitely his accounts of capability. And the democracy section, well, that's in a sense an outgrowth of the justice account. And that's maybe why that's where I'm most critical, because there is a certain circularity there, especially around deliberation, around reason and the function of reason in that deliberative process. So there is a certain repetition, if you want, of the central force and power of practical reason in determining just outcomes and in determining democratically just outcomes.
Right, right.
And another thing is there is a very strong emphasis on impartiality in this process.
Correct. Coming to our first chapter on social choice, for which Professor Sen also won the Nobel Prize. I mean, we all know it's driven by the problem of aggregating the preferences of the members of a given society. In some ways, both Arrow and Sen tend to argue against any kind of a particular individual's choice being imposed on the society in a dictatorial manner. I mean, how would you explain as to how Sen managed to integrate the idea of something which he uses, local decisiveness, into Kenneth Arrow's The Social Choices Theory, and how are they different in theory and practice? I mean, briefly, if you could explain that.
Can you repeat that?
Yeah, so what I meant was that, I mean, both Arrow and Sen, they kind of tend to argue against any kind of on the society in a dictatorial manner. I mean, how would you explain how, say, Sen manages to integrate the concept of local decisiveness that he uses in Arrow's social choice theory, and how are they different in theory and practice? I mean,
so
pairing Arrow and Sen.
So you're absolutely right that is one of the five main components that is so central to the social choice approach. And Sen doesn't want to leave that behind, right? He doesn't want to say that it's you know, it's something that liberalism or liberalism, that dictatorial thing that you're talking about, he doesn't critique liberalism and its obsession with paternalism as a way with that central component, both for democracy and for liberalism. What he does, though, is that he says, well, there are both objective and subjective components to an evaluative process in any social choice, in any practical social choice mechanism or analysis of a particular policy, okay? And those subjective and objective analyses are going to involve both external accounts of what people's articulated preferences are, and maybe other things like their needs and desires or whatever, but also objective accounts of what their conditions are. So whether they come from extreme poverty, whether they have access to water, whether they don't have access to water, whether they're very rich, and they're stating that they need a preference for the best highway on earth because they have them under the best conditions. All of those objective conditions matter, but what he wants to avoid is this idea that everything can be determined for social and economic policy based on those objective conditions alone, excluding people's needs and interests, or even including people's needs and interests from an objective perspective. Because he says quite clearly that even if you had an objective account of people's needs, interests, and conditions, you would be leaving out not only the significance of agency and freedom that they articulate when they articulate their preferences, but you'd also be leaving out a whole series of objectively important components of the evaluative process. And that is what my preferences say in and of themselves and about those conditions plus my preferences about how the world is. choice type analysis, which he actually ends up avoiding if you look at the way he articulates capabilities. People's preference in the evaluative process. Unlike Arrow, though, so the main difference is that he is happy to sort of, in social choice terms, he's happy to say that an impossibility theorem is only a kind of indicator of not an insurmountable contradiction around, say, democracy and liberalism. It's just a simple indicator of what sorts of things we may need to tweak in that social choice analysis for us to get, okay? So he very cleverly says, what's the point of these theorems? What's the point of these theorems that lead us to impossibility outcomes? Well, the point of them is to say, maybe one or more of our conditions are too strict. And so we may need to roll back or reassess or rearticulate or redefine one set of those conditions. As regards dictatorship of preferences, I don't think he parts ways very much with Arrow, right? Because the capabilities approach still allows for the central component of preferences. But here's a really important point. Other capabilities approaches do part way. So for example, if you read Martha Nussbaum's work doesn't have any real requirement for people's stated preferences about the list of capabilities and functionings that she puts down on paper. That is where Sen would start to say, as a liberal, now we need to be careful. There's room here for paternalism. There's room here for people's preferences to be dictated.
Explain. Professor Hamilton, on the capability approach itself, I mean, Sen, of course, emphasizes that he's not concerned with what people have, but with what they can potentially have, as you said. But I mean, something which he calls in the technical terms functionings. But these functionings, don't you think, can be questioned and can be potentially overridden because they might not correctly reflect a person's interest? So do you think the key issue relates to the selection of functionings than what potentially he might desire? I mean, and does the capability approach kind of assume that the selection of functioning is done in a rational manner, much like the rational assumption of the utilitarian approach?
Another great question. What he tries to do, and some would say he's trying to have his cake and eat it here, what he's trying to do is he's trying to say, there are, of course, some basic functionings that we all require to be in place in order for us to enact our capabilities. And what he's effectively saying is that at a very abstract level or a pared down level, depends how you view it, of course, you know, it's not going to be that much up for debate when you say people need X amount of water per day or per week in order to continue living, or people need X amount of nutrition to continue living. But as soon as you get beyond that, then the discussion becomes more complex and more contextual as well. But it's important to say that even at that very biological level, if you might say, you know, I could continue living for months at a very low nutritional value, right? So I could continue physically functioning at a very low nutritional intake. But but I couldn't do that much more than simply physically function. So I think there's an important, now I must be careful when I say these kinds of things that I don't read too much into what Sen himself is arguing. So feel free to correct me if you think I'm reading too much in. But the sense I get from this account is that from an objective perspective, but that as soon as we get into asking people in context what their capabilities are and what they ought to be, as soon as we get into these questions of freedom and agency, then even some of those most biological functionings will become contextualized, because we'll say, right, you may be getting some basic nutritional level of food, but is that basic nutritional level actually enabling you to do more than simply feed yourself? Because that's not what it is to be a human being. To be a human being is to do more than simply feed yourself. It's to be an active member in your community. It's to be a critical member in your community. It's to be involved in the politics of your society, etc., etc., etc. So he has a much more ample view of what it is to be a functioning member. But the distinction, I think, is the distinction that is between functionings and capabilities is to do with the idea that from a relatively objective perspective, we can specify the set of functionings. But if we want to get into a clear and non-dictatorial account of capabilities and potentialities, we need to involve subjects and groups in that process. And that's where agency and freedom come in. But there's a huge amount of debate there. There's a huge amount of criticism and debate about what in any particular context, what that might involve. And you're right to make a critique there, or a sort of veiled critique of the idea that there's a certain imposition, if you want, of reason around what the basic functionings are.
Right.
But his response would be, well, look, I'm saying that these things are so basic that there isn't really going to be much disagreement around this.
Correct. Coming to written about quite regularly in terms of the comparison with Sen and Marx. So Sen has often been credited with the moral and the material critique of capitalism. For example, he explains that to understand why people go hungry, don't kind of look out just for catastrophic crop failure, but rather look for the malfunctions of the moral economy. So how would you compare Marx and Sen in understanding the critique of capitalism? I don't know whether that's part of your book, but that's something that that would be interesting to explore.
That, again, is a great question. It is a very big question, and I'm sure I'm not going to give you a very good answer. That is not the book, because for me, and for me, of Sen, in terms of the intellect, and given the intellectual environment in which a lot of his formation takes place, at least in the West, he is, as it were, a bridge between the kind of liberalism of John Rawls and the staunch historical materialism of Sen. And what he sees, my sense is that he sees himself somehow finding a path, and he is just speaking comparatively then directly to your question, what really distinguishes Marx from someone like Sen, of course, is that Marx is ultimately concerned with the critique of capitalism, a very staunch critique of capitalism, and an attempt to find ways to move beyond capitalism through political means, but ultimately through an answer that is more or less economic, right? He thinks that under communism, there would be an economic solution that capitalism fails to provide, even though capitalism is a massive advance on feudalism and et cetera, right? You know the argument. Sen is less concerned to argue for the complete dissolution or overcoming of capitalism, but he's more interested in saying, well, look, there's various ways in which capitalism failed dismally. Market failure is one of them. The overemphasis on preferences and utility as an underpinning for the main underpinning for much of capitalism is another one of them. But he's much more of a liberal than someone like Karl Marx was. And so he's not interested in overturning this capitalist structure. He once famously says, to imagine that you could proceed without markets would be the same as imagining that you could proceed in economics, politics, and society without language. So he literally sees markets as fundamental to the basic means of proceeding, the basic means of the economy proceeding in any society, frankly. So this is not some suggestion that, you know, markets are inherently exploitative, or markets are all about alienation. They fail in various ways. They do exploit in various ways, in various places, much worse than others. And actually, some of his work, especially around famines, and some of his and Jean Drèze's work on India, is actually mostly about how to get people into the market rather than out of it, right? So much of the work is about saying, look, one of the ways in which a lot of people are unfree is that they're unable to actually act as more or less free providers or consumers in the market economy. And that's much more disempowering than the exploitation that takes place within the market economy. But at the same time, the capability approach is a strong ethical critique of capitalism, because he's saying that capitalism leads to a whole series of really problematic outcomes: extreme poverty, extreme inequality. He would even suggest, I think, that in its worst forms, it leads to a certain kind of populist identity politics. So it has a whole series of effects that he wants to criticize. But in no sense does he want us to overthrow the basic functioning of markets.
Right. As we come to the end of the discussion, much of Sen's concepts have actually been very qualitative in nature and do not quite get reflected in policy discussions, and often criticized for lacking realism. As far as the individual is concerned, the 5 themes that your book talks about remains some of the basic requirements. And given Professor Sen's interdisciplinary approach, how do you juxtapose the quantitative definitions of economic development and Sen's approach?
Yeah, great question again. I mean, I'm not primarily an economist, so I'm going to probably leave a lot of you dissatisfied, but I'll answer that question. But he's on as regards the capabilities approach has been exactly around this point about quantification, or how do we actually, to use a terrible term that economists keep using, operationalize this this account. In other words, what a lot of economists are concerned with, even if they agree in ethical terms with what he proposes, what they're most concerned with is, yes, sure, we agree with how to fit this into a welfare function, say, or some kind of mechanism that'll enable us to quantify problems in context and then give economic style responses. I think Amartya Sen's response to this would be, well, we've got to think harder. We've got to think outside of the box of the models that we've been given by economics as regards how to do this. Frankly, we have to change our mathematical models, the mathematical subcomponents of the account. Political economy and economics and moral economy, as you've said, are the prime movers, is the basis, the foundation. The mathematical modeling that we require for our policy assessment and our policy prescription is secondary. We have to make, we have to be better at it. We have to provide means through which we can do this in a way that allows a qualitative view. People have tried, and there has been some effect on the United Nations, on the World Bank. The HDI, the Human Development Index, is something that has come out of Sen's and many of his famous colleagues' work, both in India and beyond. So there are ways in which you can find indices out of this kind of work. I think that the problem isn't the mathematics, the problem is the political will in a lot of these places. So I think the mathematics and the modeling can easily follow. It's the political will to change the way we think about growth. It's the political will to change the way we think about how to organize our polities and economies. That for me, and I think for him, is the core problem. But you're right. The second part of your question is spot on, and that's the second main critique that I propose in that book, and it's related to the point I made about power and power relations. There is a deep lack of realism in this account, in the account of capabilities, in the account of justice, in the account of democracy. And, I think that it would be helpful if we sort of gave it a little bit more of a realist component and to be less reliant on, reason, rationality, impartiality, deliberation in the political, economic, and social contexts, and be a little bit more forceful about what sorts of institutions would be necessary and ones to bring about. I speak a bit about this in my other book called Freedom is Power, which is all about representation and power relations. And there's a more, his Theoria account, a certain kind of Republican reading of Machiavelli that also provides some collateral or some basis for this argument. The most famous is Machiavellian Democracy by John McCormack. And there's a great new book by Camilla Vergara called Systemic Corruption. It's all to focus on our choices and our preferences and our bidas in his insistence to focus on social. but we also need under what conditions our choices and our preference are generated. Because these things don't just fall. We have preferences dependent upon context, dependent upon institutional arrangements. And so as political and social and economic theorists, we ought to be thinking about those institutional arrangements. And Sen does not want to think about those institutional arrangements. If you read the idea of justice carefully, he is very adamant that this is a social choice-based account. It's about thinking how better to influence behavior, frankly, rather than start with institutions. I think it's not either or. We should be doing both. And if we were to do both, we would see the power relations very quickly. And we would see the way in which democracy is distorted by oligarchic arrangements. I mean, the perfect example has been shown to us over the last 4 or 5 years in the United States of America. The great oligarch that we see now, inciting people to storm the Capitol, and who has been supported by very powerful, very rich Republican supporters who have given people like Ted Cruz and others license, not just license, but the power to stand up in Congress and defend the indefensible.
Thank you, Professor Hamilton. That's been a terrific discussion. And listeners will surely get a lot of fodder around the works of Professor Sen, and I'm sure they'll go on to buy your book. I'll definitely buy your book. And I'm told that it's a very slim book. It's something that is written in a very lucid manner. Let me end by asking you something very personal about Professor Amartya Sen, if you would allow me. We would like to know, since you've been his student, if I am not wrong, in the post-graduation days as well as in the early part of your PhD life, how was he as an individual? And more so, if you could share some snippets around having the honor of kind of working with him, as you do it right along writing the book, in terms of criticizing his ideas, how open was he to accepting that criticism, and how has he been in terms of being a supervisor at different points in time?
Yes, sure, with pleasure. He supervised me for an essay at master's level, and he supervised me for a year of my PhD when my main supervisor was away on leave. I also wrote my first published paper in Government and Opposition, which was called The Theory of True Interests in the work of Amartya Sen. And that was, in fact, quite a critical account. And he was, at the time, supervising me at the PhD level, because I published it straight after the master's. And all I can say is that he is a model of grace and incredible intellectual power. It was a very amazing experience for me as I suppose I should say, especially as a South African, coming from a very distorted place historically, and being allowed into these hallowed, he was head of Trinity, he was master of Trinity at the time, and I would walk into this incredible building, which, at the time I was quite a Marxist, so I thought it was a little bit overblown, but he was wonderful to be around, absolutely amazing, down to earth, capacious teacher who took my fumbling criticisms back then with perfect grace. And I have two, I suppose, little stories to tell. I used to wait for him to supervise me in this incredibly grand room, and he was simultaneously master of Trinity and writing countless papers and books. He had about 2 or 3 secretaries and assistants in a separate part of the lodge. But the doors were all open, and I would sit there patiently. And I remember the one day literally hearing him dictate a paper that I think ended up a philosophy paper. I remember seeing out of the corner of my eye him walking around the room and dictating it, and his secretary or assistant was taking it down. And I remember reading that paper 2 or 3 years later, and there had been very little change from what I'd heard dictated on the hoof by this intellectual giant and what ended up as the published piece. So literally, yeah, he was a really, really wonderful teacher, and I feel extremely privileged to have been taught by him, even to have met him, but to have been taught by him as much as I was amazing. So every time I criticize him, I feel terrible, I have to say, but I also feel obliged to be honest to the ideas.
Yeah, and we feel privileged to kind of listen to your talks around Professor Amartya Sen. Thank you, Professor Hamilton, in agreeing to our request and delivering this talk. We hope to have you in India and maybe at our campus when the COVID thing recedes.
I would love that dearly.
Surely. Thank you very much. And we will share this video on the YouTube platform for the rest of the viewers. And I'm sure there'll be many more buyers of your book in times to come.
Fantastic. Please do send me the link.
Absolutely. Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you.
Bye-bye. Good evening.